What's up guys, thanks for stopping by. I hope you're doing good. In today's video, I'm super excited to share another challenge that has never been done before in the world of Valheim. This has been one of my most requested videos, and for a long time, it didn't even seem possible. So I'm super happy we're finally able to make this video a reality. But I don't want to keep you waiting any longer. I hope you enjoy this video, and without further ado, let's jump in to the world's first Mistlands only challenge. The Mistlands, the latest and also hardest biome in Valheim. When Valheim first launched, there was a general consensus from the game's most dedicated players that Valheim could do to be a little more challenging. But when Mistlands was released, there was a huge outcry from the community that the developers had gone too far and that Mistlands was actually too difficult. And so lots of things were rebalanced, but it still remains the most challenging part of the game by far. What you're looking at right now is not edited. This is a Valheim world that's been modded to be one giant Mistlands. No meadows, no black forest, no swamp, no mountains, no plains, just ocean and one entire Valheim world's worth of Mistlands. And in today's video, I'm going to be beating the game's final boss, starting with nothing and using only things I could find in the Mistlands, traverse and survive this insane, brutal world made up entirely of the game's hardest biome. This is the Mistlands only challenge. Okay, so to break down this challenge, let's first explain the goal. The goal is simple: to defeat the Queen. As for what we can't do, well, that's also mostly made very simple for us as well, mostly by the fact that no other biomes on the map exist except for the ocean. This means that the vast majority of items in the game can't be crafted simply because the mats needed to make them just don't exist. As for other rules, we'll basically be sticking to the glitchless rule set from the speedrun, which if you don't know, I'll leave a link in the description to the speedrun page so you can read that. But the simple explanation is no using any glitches that involve clipping through walls, duplicating items, or world switching. This means we can't just clip into the Queen's lair. We have to make a seal breaker no matter what, which of course also forces us into some of the most dangerous parts of the game with very minimal gear. There's also a bunch of other complications with playing on a world that's just Mistlands, but we'll get into that later. In the meantime, you might be wondering, how are we gonna do this? Well, let's jump into it and find out. As we jump into the mist, our first order of business is to find dwarven towers. Not only because finding an extractor is essential in order for us to make a seal breaker, but also because there's a ton of useful mats that you can get from towers. However, this is where we immediately run into our first complication of the run. Dwarven towers are populated with dwarves, and the second we try to harvest anything from a tower, they're going to immediately attack us, and that simply isn't a fight we can win. Not to mention the fact that we don't even have anything to harvest with, and these two things combined pretty much make getting anything out of a tower impossible. So, before we can harvest a tower, we're going to need to get some mats elsewhere, and for that, we're going to need some help from our friend, the soldier. Soldiers are one of the toughest mobs in the game. However, much like trolls, they can be baited to mine materials for you, provided you survive the process. The plan is to find a soldier and bait it into attacking some rocks and also some trees so we can get started with some basic tools. However, before I even got started with the challenge, I did some testing on a different Mistlands world, and whilst doing so, encountered a problem that seemed to render it impossible to complete the challenge before it was even started. No! No! For some reason, when I created a world that was all Mistlands, there wasn't a single soldier to be found. And this is where I have to introduce valued community member and our friend, Honey Badger. Honey Badger is the modder that helped me get this world working in the first place, and his help would become essential in figuring out what was going on. I thought there was a bug being caused by the mod, but after consulting Honey Badger, he had developed a theory based on looking at the Valheim wiki and the Unity output console that soldiers may only spawn a little after an hour of gameplay. So being convinced Honey Badger was onto something, I created a new Mistlands world and left it running, just to see if a soldier would eventually spawn. Turns out he was right, and thankfully the challenge was still on. So shout out to Honey Badger, this video wouldn't be possible without him. So, after spending an hour getting the lay of the land and scouting for various points of interest like dwarven towers and dungeons, I finally found a soldier, baited it to some rocks and trees, and whilst dodge rolling and running away to avoid death, finally got some wood and some rocks that would allow us to make some starter tools. Now we were armed with a stone axe, a hammer, some wood, and a bunch of stone. It was time to take on a dwarven tower. But how? Obviously a stone axe is no match for these dwarven mages and rogues. Well, you might have guessed it already, but it's time for Valheim's ultimate weapon, the campfire. The plan for this strat was to place a campfire somewhere outside the tower. Because of the ward inside the tower, it wouldn't be possible to place anywhere inside, so the campfire would have to be outside of the ward's range, as destroying the ward is also not possible at this point because it would aggro every dwarf in the area, and that is exactly what we're trying to avoid. So we'd place a fire and then push each dwarf one by one onto the fire until they'd eventually burn to death. However, this would prove to be more complicated than it sounds, because the dwarves would sometimes randomly run away or start to push against me, and so it was a lot of trial and error of fighting against the dwarves' AI, where if a dwarf would try and get away, I'd have to push them back, or sometimes they'd completely get away and I'd have to start the process all over again. It took some time, but eventually every dwarf was taken care of, and once the smell of burnt dwarven flesh had cleared, it was time to harvest the tower for some useful mats. First, we took out the ward so we can craft, and after that, gathering mats would mostly involve using ladders to build up to every last piece of wood inside the tower and chopping it down with a stone axe, occasionally getting some copper scrap from the beams, and also certainly cores and more copper by attacking the lanterns. We were also able to grab our essential extractor along with some brains dropped by the dwarves, which we would also be needing later on. All of this wasn't without its complications. We were attacked by a mob of seekers, which were also able to burn to death with campfires, and were even attacked by a jarl at one point, which, while very scary, weirdly wouldn't attack us so long as we stayed inside. The run was well underway. We were making great progress, and the plan was to take our newly found mats back to spawn, where we'd been storing everything we'd found so far in some gravestones that we were using as makeshift chests. The first day of the challenge was coming to an end, but the most difficult thing we'd do this day, and one of the most difficult things in the whole run, was still ahead of us. we were going to take on a Seeker soldier. Now, even though we technically did want to kill a soldier so we could get mats to make a spear, it wasn't really necessary to take one on this early in the run with basically no gear. What happened was I had just taken on a regular Seeker with basically no food, with nothing but a torch and my fists, because it was blocking our spawn and being a nuisance while we're trying to organize loot. And when I defeated the Seeker, it got me wondering whether or not it was possible to beat a soldier with no armor or weapons and without cheesing it with a fire. After experimenting a little, I had decided that it was in fact possible, but may not be worth the time it would take. Then someone in the chat was doubting me and saying it wasn't possible, and this was frankly enough for me to add it to the list of things that we have to do in this run. As for me personally, as someone that puts a lot of time into doing things that have never been done before in these videos, nothing inspires me more than accomplishing something that may at first seem impossible. So thank you to the random people in the chat and the comments that come up with impossible ideas and doubting comments. I couldn't make videos like this without you guys to inspire me. And so began the saga of the unarmed Seeker soldier battle. This took a long time. Seeker soldiers have 1,500 health, and at my current unarmed skill level at the start of the fight, I was dealing around 2 damage per hit. So even if we're attacking once per second, this was still going to take a very long time. Plus, soldiers regen basically half an HP point per second, so if we weren't consistently doing damage, it would literally become impossible. However, after some trial and error, I realized that if we timed our attacks correctly, we could attack either immediately after a slam attack or immediately after the soldier did this scream animation, and use the time that this animation takes to run around to the back of the soldier and punch it in its weak spot. And doing this very consistently, combined with the fact that we deal slightly more damage over time as we leveled up our unarmed skill, meant that we could consistently outpace the soldier's regen, which meant that all we had to do was be consistent enough with our movement and dodges to keep this up long enough to remove all 1,500 HP. If we died, the soldier would regen a huge amount of health relative to our DPS, so I had to find a rhythm and die as little as possible. I haven't fought anything in Valheim that requires this level of consistency, but after 1.5 hours, we finally did it. The soldier was defeated and we were one step closer to making a spear. This was easily one of the hardest things I've done in Valheim so far, which probably makes this a good time to mention the fact that if you doubt whether anything in this challenge actually happened, or you just want to see the full unedited gameplay, you can see it all in the playlist linked in the description and in the card in the top right. I streamed the whole thing live on this very YouTube channel, and if you want to catch more live challenges and speedrun attempts, you can subscribe to this YouTube channel or follow me on Twitch at twitch.tv/NickRawcliffe. The first day of the challenge was over, and on day 2 it was time to put some of our hard-earned mats to use. Starting out by making a kiln using the cores from the lanterns in the Dwarven Tower and the stones we got from kiting the soldier. Then we used some of the wood to make coal, we placed our extractor, and when the coal was done, we deconstructed the kiln and made it into a smelter, where we turned the copper scrap into copper ingots, and we turned a couple of iron scrap that we got from kiting the soldier to some giant armor into iron ingots, and with this, we'd now be able to make a forge and a stone cutter, which means we were now ready to tackle the next key part of the challenge, which was finding a bridge. These bridges scattered randomly across the Mistlands provide an opportunity to gather some more important mats, and after some exploring, we found one, and after swimming over, began deconstruction of the marble by using the stone cutter. Removing the marble reveals a skeleton of iron bars beneath, supporting the structure, and using a forge, deconstructing those gave us a ton of iron ingots, which would become vital later in the challenge. Then we began ferrying our new mats back to spawn, where we were storing all of our loot. So far in this video, we've focused on the big picture stuff, the main hurdles and objectives we've had to overcome in the challenge. But there's actually 2 things that we were doing throughout the challenge every single day that easily took up most of our time during the run: traversal and dungeons. Let's start with traversal. I'm sure lots of you are probably watching this and wondering, how is this even possible with all the mist? Or why is there hardly any mist on the screen? Did he make a wisp light, or does the mod clear the mist? Actually, no. Even though from the outside looking in, it might look like Mistlands is filled with one giant block of mist, in reality, it's not. Mist is actually scattered somewhat randomly. There's a lot of it, obviously, but if you get lucky, there'll be large patches of land with no mist. So we mainly just try and explore all the areas that we can find and get to that aren't covered in mist, hoping we find something useful. If we do have mist to deal with, we climb up as high as we can get, as the mist actually doesn't appear above a certain height, and key locations like towers, dungeons and bridges can often be seen from up high. And if you stay in the craggy cliffs of Mistlands, you can often explore quite far without having to go into the mist. Then of course, inevitably, we will have to go into the mist from time to time, and for those moments we just go in blind. We zoom the camera all the way in so we can see our immediate surroundings a little bit better, so we don't walk off a cliff or walk into an enemy, and we try and use as little stamina as possible, as we want to conserve that for when we have to run away from enemies or climb up high. None of this is foolproof, but if you're patient, it works, and using these strats we were able to get around enough to get the challenge done. Although it didn't always go smoothly, we did die a lot. Also, I feel like at this point it's worth clarifying. If we encounter an enemy that we don't have to fight, for the most part, we're running. For a huge percentage of this run, we were basically defenseless, so running is our go-to approach. However, if our seeker is guarding a dungeon or something that we need to get to, we'll usually kill it with a combination of fire and our fists, which almost always requires a lot of dodging. Dungeons. For dungeons, there's a lot to explain. Let's just start by talking about why dungeons are so important in this run. Dungeons are essential for us for finding 3 things: the Queen Veg Vizier for the boss location, seal breaker fragments, of which we need 9 so we can make a seal breaker to get inside the Queen's lair, and black cores, which are needed for a few essential recipes. All this meant that we needed to loot a ton of dungeons. The Queen Veg Vizier is kind of rare, so we need to loot several for that, and fragments are not that common either, and especially when you need 9, it always takes a lot of dungeons unless you get super lucky. Not to mention the fact that the chests inside dungeons in the Mistlands actually have really good loot that would give us some free food and potions. Which brings us on to something very important that we need to explain about this mod, and for that we need to go back to our friend Honey Badger. Okay, so to explain this next part, I need to explain a little bit about how this mod works and some of the history behind it. Almost 2 years ago, I made a video called the Valheim Swamp Only Challenge. This was a video I wanted to make for a long time, but it was never actually possible. That's until almost a year after I had the initial idea, I came across a mod called World Gen Options. This was a mod that allowed you to customize how your Valheim world was generated via a config file. One of the features of this mod was that it allowed you to swap one biome for another. And although it wasn't really designed for it, I decided to dive into the config file and see what would happen if I basically just replaced every biome with the swamp biome in order to create one giant swamp. It worked. However, there was a catch. Partway through streaming and recording the challenge, I realized that something about my world was actually broken. There wasn't enough crypts or points of interest, like shacks and towers, which basically made looking for key items like looking for a needle in a haystack, by which I mean that basic things like crypts were literally something like 8 times rarer than vanilla Valheim. This was when Honey Badger first came to the rescue. He reached out and told me he could probably fix it by making his own mod that corrected the issue. If you want to watch the video, I'll link it in the description. I highly recommend it. Fast forward to 2023 when the Mistlands Only project began, and since posting the Swamp Only video, I had several requests from viewers wanting to see a Mistlands Only challenge. However, it was impossible for 2 reasons. One of which being that the old mod World Gen Options was actually out of date now and didn't work with the current version of Valheim. So I reached out to Honey Badger to see if he could help. And of course, like the legend he is, he delivered and got the mod working. However, the second reason the challenge was impossible is what brings us back to our run, because it has to do with chests. Some of you might have worked this out already, but beating the Queen on a world that's just Mistlands is not actually possible without clipping into the Queen's lair. And I thought it would be much more interesting without doing that, as clipping into the boss lair would actually skip most of the challenge. But why is it not possible? It's not possible because you need black metal, and black metal doesn't actually spawn anywhere in the Mistlands. In order to make a seal breaker to unlock the boss lair, you need a golder table. And golder tables require black metal. Not only that, but golder tables also require refined ether, and to make that you need an ether refinery, which also requires black metal. And to make ether with the refinery, you also need sap, which you get from using an extractor, which also requires black metal. So you get the idea. Black metal is actually essential. Therefore, the mod has to add black metal somewhere. And the way we get around it? Well, the mod makes it so that chests inside dungeons now have a random chance to spawn black metal. They also have a random chance of spawning tin. Adding tin makes it possible to craft a cart by combining it with the copper scrap that we found in towers. And carts allow us to do 2 of the most fun and lesser known tricks in Valheim. The first one you may be familiar with if you've seen my vegan challenge video. The cart can actually be used as a makeshift boat, as it actually floats, and by simply walking inside the cart you can push it along the water while being inside it. This is actually super fun and much more interesting than making a boat. The cart would also come in extremely useful when looting dwarven towers for more loot. Towers give us access to one of our best sources of wood, but also we would need to collect more brains to make ether, which can be found in boxes that spawn inside dwarven settlements. As mentioned earlier, this would be a problem because of the dwarves inside and because of the ward, but with the cart, instead of having to cook each dwarf alive one by one, we could save a ton of time by smashing the cart over and over into the ward until it broke. Because we technically never touch it, it doesn't aggro the dwarves. So from the moment we had a cart, dwarven towers became a lot easier to deal with, and even became our makeshift home from time to time, whilst out exploring and looking for more dungeons, which of course were now super valuable, not just because of having potential boss runes, fragments or cores, but also because they now have a chance of spawning black metal. Now we've explained Traversal and how the mod works, let's get back to day 2. After looting a few dungeons, we made an ether refinery using the marble we got from the bridge, black metal and cores from a dungeon, Yggdrasil wood from kiting a soldier, and sap from the extractor we placed earlier. Then we placed the rest of our sap and brains into the refinery to turn it into refined ether. Next, we made a black forge, and using all the iron we got from deconstructing the bridge, we made a demolisher. The demolisher would be our go-to weapon for most of the run, being one of the few weapons we could actually make. This was a huge step up and marked the end of day 2. By day 3, we'd found most of the key items we needed to complete the challenge, except for Sealbreaker fragments. After 2 whole days of gaming, we'd still only found 1 Sealbreaker fragment. So on day 3, we spent the whole session finding and looting dungeons. Previously, we'd spent most of our time in dungeons, dodging and running away from enemies, or standing in the entrance gradually burning them one by one. However, now with the Demolisher, we had the ultimate weapon, because not only could we fight enemies head on, but because of the Demolisher's slam attack, we were now able to kill enemies through walls and doors, which became essential as it finally provided us with a way to fully clear out and loot dungeons. Whilst we're out exploring, we also encountered another Seeker soldier that we managed to kite into a group of dwarves, and with our second Seeker soldier mandible, we were able to make a carapace spear. After clearing and looting several dungeons, we ended day 3 with 5 out of the 9 Sealbreaker fragments we needed. We'd made great progress and we were getting closer and closer to our final goal. But day 4 would be where we'd face our ultimate challenge. At the start of day 4, we finally got lucky and found our Queen Vegvasir, and after 5 more hours of making our way to the boss and looting for our remaining 4 fragments, we finally make our Sealbreaker and made our way to the Queen's lair. After clearing out the Seekers, we used the structure under the stairs as a temporary base and placed a bed in preparation for the inevitable many deaths that would follow as we attempt to take on the Queen with little more than a few mushrooms, a demolisher, and a spear. This was our final fight, and it was not simple. To explain how this boss fight was even possible, let's start by explaining the challenges with the boss fight itself. Obviously, the main threat is the Queen. She does a huge amount of damage that we simply will not be able to survive a single hit of. She also has a ranged poison attack that would be equally as fatal. However, if we just had the Queen to deal with, it would be a lot more manageable. But one of the biggest complications with this boss fight is the fact that Seekers and Seeker broods also spawn in massive numbers. And considering the challenges we've had so far with mobs in the run, this is a major complication. Now, there used to be a solution to this. When Mistlands first launched, it was possible to stay behind the wall in the entrance of the boss lair after aggroing the Queen and using the Demolisher attack the Queen through the wall, because, as mentioned earlier, the slam attack of the Demolisher actually clips through walls. In this position, you're actually out of the Queen's reach. However, despite this, she will actually continue moving forwards towards the player to try and attack. Therefore, you could actually keep her pinned on the wall whilst attacking with the Demolisher from safety the entire time. However, this strat was actually patched out by the developers. Changes were made to the Queen's AI, which now meant that if the Queen is aggroed and if she also can't reach the player, she'll actually de-aggro and wander off into an idle animation, which prevents you from pinning her against the wall and easily defeating her from safety. This fix would hypothetically make the Demolisher strat impossible. That's until we start to use a couple more speedrun tricks to manipulate the boss's AI. This is where we finally have to talk about the speed. You guys probably remember that earlier in the video I described some pretty epic struggles we had dealing with Seeker soldiers, all to collect 2 Seeker soldier mandibles. This was all to make a carapace spear, because all spears in Valheim have one very unique trait that is also one of the lesser known things in the game. When you throw a spear at the ground, it immediately aggroes all the enemies in the nearby area. This actually can often be an annoying side effect of using the spear when playing the game normally, but for the speedrun and for our Mistlands only challenge, this is a huge help. It means that now we can aggro the boss, kite her to the wall, deal some damage with the Demolisher, then when the Queen de-aggroes, we can throw the spear to re-aggro and rinse and repeat the process over and over again. However, there are also 2 major catches with this. The first one being that if there are any other mobs in the area, they will also get aggroed by the spear, meaning that we had to take on several mobs that we would most likely die to at some point, which would give the Queen plenty of time to regen her health, as all creatures in Valheim regen 1.67% of their health per minute. This is something we just had to deal with. The second major catch is that once the Queen de-aggroes, there is actually a cooldown of several seconds where it is not immediately possible to re-aggro the boss, and during this time the boss randomly walks around with the possibility of wandering outside of the spear's aggro range, meaning that on occasion we would have to wander further into the boss's lair in order to re-aggro, potentially attracting even more attention from mobs. Progress was slow. We were dealing damage, but the amount of Seekers we were having to fight and the amount of times we were dying also meant that a lot of the damage we dealt was lost to the Queen's health regen. Plus, we also had to periodically take breaks to repair our Demolisher, further increasing the amount of health regened by the boss. Progress on this boss, even to this day, even on the speed run, is extremely tedious, to the point that the Mistlands segment of the run actually puts off a lot of runners from doing attempts because of how long and how tedious it can be. However, during the Mistlands only challenge, I did discover one trick that makes the process considerably more bearable, and it has to do with relogs. Relogs are actually used periodically throughout Valheim speedruns, mostly to remove status effects like poison or remove an enemy aggro, providing the player has gotten out of the enemy's line of sight. However, there is also one lesser used relog strat that actually can be very useful. When you relog during a boss fight, it actually resets the boss's AI. For example, if Modder has landed somewhere too far away that you can't reach, you can actually relog and she'll start to fly again. Or if you're fighting your Gluth using the underground speedrun strat and he aggroes and is about to destroy your setup and you along with it, you can relog, and so long as he doesn't aggro again, you can save the run. This led to me experimenting with the same strat on the Queen, and I was pleasantly surprised to find out that it does in fact have some use. For example, when you lose Queen aggro because of the AI patch, sometimes she wanders off outside of the spear aggro range, and relogging during this time can either cancel aggro cooldown or reset her AI to the point that she will stop running away, and if you're lucky, move back into spear aggro range. The final super useful thing about relogs is that when timed correctly, they can be done to prevent the Queen's animation that causes Seekers to spawn, therefore reducing the amount amount of mobs to deal with, making the whole process a lot smoother with a lot less queen HP being regenerated. I know this is all super complicated and it's still super tedious, but alas, using these strats allowed me to finally deal good consistent damage on the queen and finally beat the Mistlands only challenge. It was over. After days of figuring out whether or not this challenge was even possible, working with a modder to even get it working, 18 hours of gameplay, 190 deaths. Finally, the world's first Mistlands only challenge was complete. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, please leave a like and comment and subscribe for future content because it really helps with the YouTube algorithm. I've been working on this video for months. It's pretty normal for these challenge videos I make to take a very long time because I am editing hours and hours of footage. But for this video, I wanted to go the extra mile and I wanted it to be the longest challenge video I've made so far. And it is, and I'm super proud of it. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. I learned a bunch of new things. I really tried hard to take my editing to the next level in this one. Stuff like this is why my Patreon is so important. Being a YouTuber, you're pressured to constantly put out content and serve the algorithm in order to make any money. So supporting me on Patreon really helps me make video projects like this that require so much time and investment to get out. Not to mention the fact that in return you get access to some Valheim servers. So if you would like to help out, supporting on Patreon is always appreciated. There's a link in the description to that. I also stream live on this very YouTube channel and also live on Twitch at twitch.tv/NickRawcliffe. So leave a link in the description to that as well if you're interested in that. I want to do one last thank you for Honey Badger for helping us out making this video. Remember, you can get the full unedited footage of me streaming this live at the playlist in the link in the description if you want to see this challenge in its entirety. You can follow me on social media and join my Discord at the links below. And until next time, have a good one.